Something about this feels coordinated. Over the past few days, criticism surrounding Shedeur Sanders and Deion Sanders hasn't just appeared, it's stacked. An article drops, a former Colorado legend speaks out, podcast clips start circulating, social media grabs the quotes, and suddenly the same talking points are everywhere. That's when people start asking questions. Is this just normal sports debate, or is this the beginning of a narrative being shaped in real time? Because here's what makes it interesting: the spark wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a losing season. It wasn't some off-field drama. It was a jersey retirement at the University of Colorado Boulder. That's supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it turned into a dividing line. One former player reportedly said that retiring Shedeur's number was the moment he tapped out. That's strong language. And when alumni start publicly distancing themselves, the conversation shifts from opinion to tension. Now it's not just fans debating online. It's legacy versus new era. Tradition versus transformation. And whenever a program changes this fast, especially under a personality as big as Coach Prime, resistance is almost guaranteed. But here's the part that makes this different: the tone feels sharper, more personal, less about play calling and more about character. And when criticism moves from football to identity, that's when things escalate. So the real question isn't whether people disagree. It's why the disagreement suddenly feels amplified. Because this doesn't feel random. And what happens next might say more about the culture around college football than the game itself. It was supposed to be a celebration. When the University of Colorado Boulder announced the retirement of Shedeur Sanders' number alongside Travis Hunter, the moment was framed as symbolic, a stamp on a new era, a recognition of impact, a sign that the program had turned a corner under Deion Sanders. But instead of uniting the fan base, it exposed a fault line. Almost immediately, debates started brewing. Some longtime supporters reportedly felt the honor came too quickly. Others argued that jersey retirements are sacred, meant for careers that span decades, not seasons. On the surface, that sounds like a tradition argument. But the reaction felt stronger than just timing concerns. Then came the headline that intensified everything. A decorated former Colorado player said the jersey retirement was his breaking point. He claimed that decision made him tap out on supporting the program the way he once did. That's not mild disappointment. That's symbolic withdrawal. And when alumni publicly distance themselves, it shifts the conversation from fan opinion to institutional tension. Here, what makes it interesting: Shedeur didn't invent the retirement ceremony. The university approved it. The athletic department signed off, yet the backlash centered around him. Why? Supporters argue it's because the Sanders era represents rapid transformation. Critics argue it's because tradition shouldn't be rushed. Both perspectives exist. But what can't be ignored is how quickly the celebration turned into controversy. Instead of headlines about legacy, the conversation became about legitimacy. Was it earned? Was it premature? Was it hype-driven? And once that door opened, the criticism widened beyond the jersey itself. Because this wasn't just about a number hanging in a stadium. It was about who gets to define what Colorado football represents now. And that debate is far from settled. This is where the temperature really changed. When former Colorado tight end Christian Fauria spoke publicly, it wasn't vague frustration. It was direct. He questioned Deion Sanders' coaching ability. He said there was too much flash and not enough substance. He even suggested some supporters were blindly loyal. That's not casual commentary. That's a full step back from the program. And then came the phrase that made headlines: he tapped out. Think about what that implies. This isn't just disagreement. It's emotional detachment. It's a former national champion saying he no longer feels aligned with the direction of the team he once represented. But here, where the narrative gets complicated. Fauria later clarified that he wants Colorado to succeed. He insists his criticism isn't hate, it's about standards. From his perspective, retiring Shedeur Sanders' jersey felt premature. He reportedly believes accomplishments should be measured differently. That's a fair opinion in theory. Yet the tone of his comments, questioning intelligence, dismissing wins as hollow, is what made this explode. Because when criticism moves from strategy to character, it stops feeling neutral. And supporters didn't take it lightly. To them, this wasn't about honoring history, it felt like resistance to change, resistance to how fast the spotlight shifted, resistance to a new identity replacing an old one. The deeper issue isn't whether alumni can criticize a program, of course they can. The issue is timing and intensity. Why now? Why escalate it to this level? Some fans speculate it reflects a broader tension between the old Colorado era and the prime era. Others say it's simply accountability. Either way, once a former legend publicly distances himself, the debate stops being internal. It becomes national. And that's when a football disagreement turns into a culture conversation. This is the core argument critics keep circling back to. They say it's all flash. The sunglasses, the national interviews, the celebrity sideline appearances, the cameras following every move, the prime branding that feels bigger than the program itself. To some former players and traditionalists, that doesn't look like old-school football culture, it looks like entertainment. And that's where the word substance gets thrown around. When Deion Sanders is criticized, it's rarely about energy. It's about whether that energy translates into long-term results. Can he manage games at a championship level? Can he build depth? Can he sustain success beyond headlines? Those are legitimate football questions. But here, the flip side that supporters bring up. If it's only flash, why did the University of Colorado Boulder go from national afterthought to must-watch television overnight? Why did ticket sales spike? Why did recruiting conversations shift? Why did the program become relevant in ways it hadn't been in years? Flash gets attention. Sustained performance keeps it. And that's the tension. Critics argue relevancy isn't enough. They say win the conference, win big games, prove it consistently. Until then, they see the spectacle as smoke without fire. Supporters argue that transformation takes time and that cultural change is part of substance. They point out that restoring belief in a program is a foundation, not fluff. What makes this debate intense is that both sides think they're defending the integrity of football. One side wants tradition protected. The other believes evolution is necessary. And when evolution comes wrapped in confidence and visibility, it's naturally polarizing. Because the real question is whether there's flash. There clearly is. The real question is whether people are willing to admit that flash and substance don't have to be opposites. And that answer won't come from debate. It'll come from wins. This is where the conversation shifts from football to something heavier. There's a big difference between questioning play calling and questioning a person's intelligence. Between debating strategy and suggesting someone has brainwashed supporters. Once the language moves there, it stops being about wins and losses. It becomes personal. When critics talk about Deion Sanders' coaching decisions, that's part of sports. That's fair game. But when the tone pivots toward dismissing his character or implying manipulation, the energy changes. And when Shedeur Sanders gets pulled into it, especially around honors like his jersey retirement at the University of Colorado Boulder, it widens the scope. Now it's not just about football philosophy. It's about identity. Supporters argue that the Sanders brand represents more than touchdowns. They talk about fatherhood, discipline, public confidence, a visible, unified family operating at a high level. To them, that's what draws loyalty, not blind devotion, but alignment with values. Critics, on the other hand, argue that labeling any disagreement as hate shuts down real accountability. They say scrutiny comes with visibility and high-profile programs should expect pushback. Both arguments exist. But here, what makes it volatile: once criticism feels targeted at who someone is rather than what they do, it triggers defensiveness. It stops being tactical, it becomes symbolic. That's why phrases like brainwashed fan base hit harder than bad clock management. One critiques performance, the other questions judgment and agency. And in today's media landscape, those distinctions matter. Because once a narrative frames a player or coach as more spectacle than substance, it can linger. It shapes perception beyond the field. So the real tension isn't that people disagree. It's that the disagreement feels amplified and increasingly personal. And when that happens, it rarely stays contained to football. This part rarely gets discussed openly, but it's impossible to ignore. Before Deion Sanders arrived at the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado football wasn't dominating national headlines. The stadium wasn't a cultural destination. It was a program with history, yes, but not daily relevance. Then Prime showed up. Overnight, Boulder changed. National media parked outside practice. Celebrities appeared on the sidelines. Recruits who previously wouldn't have considered Colorado suddenly took visits, and perhaps most noticeably, the fan base visually shifted. Boulder has historically had a very small black population compared to major cities. When Coach Prime arrived, thousands of new fans traveled in, many of them supporters who followed the Sanders family long before Colorado was in the picture. The energy was different. The music was different. The vibe was different. Some locals welcomed it with open arms. They loved the attention, the packed stadiums, the business boost. Others reportedly felt disoriented by how fast everything changed. Tradition felt interrupted. Familiar rhythms were replaced with something louder, more visible, more unapologetic. To be clear, there's no official statement saying this is racial tension or cultural conflict. That's speculation that circulates online among fans and commentators, but perception matters. When a program's identity shifts quickly, people respond emotionally. Supporters frame it as growth and inclusion. Critics frame it as spectacle overtaking substance. And in between those two viewpoints sits a deeper truth: rapid change makes people uncomfortable. Especially when that change comes with confidence and national influence. Because what happened in Boulder wasn't just a football turnaround. It was a cultural reset. And whenever culture resets, resistance follows. The question is whether the shift happened. It clearly did. The real question is whether people are reacting to wins and losses, or to something much bigger than the scoreboard. Now the spotlight shifts east. Because once Shedeur Sanders entered conversations connected to the Cleveland Browns, the tone subtly changed again. This isn't Boulder anymore. This is the NFL. Different expectations, different pressure, different media environment. And Cleveland is a proud football city. It has history, it has heartbreak, it has loyalty that runs deep. So when a high-profile quarterback with national attention walks into that ecosystem, reactions are going to be layered. Some fans see opportunity, energy, a spark that could elevate the franchise's profile instantly. Others are cautious. They've seen hype before, they've lived through promise before, they want proof. That's fair. But here, where things start to feel like a new battlefield. The questions being asked publicly don't always center on mechanics or scheme fit. Instead, you start hearing things like, can he handle the spotlight? Will he accept competition? Is he ready to be QB1? Subtle framing, strategic wording. None of those are unfair questions in isolation. But when the framing leans heavily into personality and narrative instead of performance, supporters notice. They argue it feels like the draft cycle storyline resurfacing, confidence being reframed as ego, visibility being reframed as distraction. Critics counter that this is just standard NFL scrutiny, that every quarterback entering a major market faces the same intensity. Both arguments have weight. But here, the tension: Cleveland doesn't just evaluate talent, it evaluates fit. And fit isn't only about throwing motion, it's about culture. If Shedeur succeeds in Cleveland, the city embraces him. If he struggles, the narrative hardens quickly. And that's why this moment feels pivotal. Because this isn't just about a roster decision. It's about whether the Sanders energy translates from college phenomenon to professional foundation. And in a city like Cleveland, that question won't stay theoretical for long. This is the part nobody says out loud, but everybody sees. When Shedeur Sanders was in college, he wasn't living like a typical student-athlete. Nil deals, luxury cars, designer fits, custom chains, visibility everywhere. He didn't move like someone waiting for opportunity, he moved like someone who already knew he belonged. For some people, that's inspiring. For others, it's irritating. Because confidence hits differently when it's visible. Supporters frame it as earned. They point out that Nil changed the game, Players can monetize their brand legally now. If you build value, you should benefit from it. That's the system working as designed. Critics, however, see something else. They question whether the lifestyle overshadows development. They wonder if the spotlight is too bright too early. They argue that humility should come before headlines. But here, where it gets complicated. Confidence from a young quarterback is often celebrated until it feels too comfortable, until it looks effortless, until it doesn't come wrapped in apology. When Shedeur reportedly brushed off massive money conversations with a "I'm good" mentality, supporters called it principle. They saw independence. They saw someone who wasn't desperate for validation. Others heard arrogance. Same moment, two completely different interpretations. And that's the power of image. Luxury cars in college, some see motivation, others see excess. A $500,000 chain, some see reward, others see distraction. But here's the deeper layer: confidence without struggle visible on the surface makes people uneasy, especially when it's generational, especially when it comes from a family that already has power and platform. It challenges the narrative that success must be quiet. And that's why this debate keeps resurfacing. Because this isn't really about cars or chains. It's about comfort with visible confidence. And in sports, especially at quarterback, confidence is mandatory. The only question is whether people prefer it understated or unapologetic. Here's the part nobody seems fully prepared for. What if they win anyway? After all the criticism, after the alumni pushback, after the flash versus substance debates, after the questions about culture, image, confidence, and control, what happens if the results start stacking up? Because that's the variable sitting quietly in the background of all this noise. If Deion Sanders continues building momentum at the University of Colorado Boulder, if the program competes at a high level, if recruits keep buying in, the narrative has to shift. And if Shedeur Sanders proves he can translate his confidence into consistent production at the next level, especially in a pressure city, the conversation changes overnight. Because criticism thrives in uncertainty. Once certainty arrives in the form of wins, highlights, and leadership under pressure, the tone softens. The same voices that demanded proof start recalibrating. The same headlines that questioned legitimacy start celebrating impact. That's how sports cycles work. But here's the deeper tension. If they fail, critics feel validated. If they succeed, critics look premature. And in today's digital era, receipts don't disappear, clips resurface. Quotes get replayed, strong takes age fast. That's why this moment feels bigger than a jersey ceremony or a podcast rant. It feels like positioning, like people staking claims before the outcome is written. Because once the scoreboard starts speaking consistently, arguments lose volume. So maybe the real story isn't the backlash. Maybe it's the possibility that the backlash won't matter. Because if the Sanders era produces sustained results, not just relevance, not just ratings, but real wins, the debate won't end with an apology. It'll end with silence. And sometimes, silence says more than criticism ever could.